The night had been still, save for the faint whisper of wind tugging at the tall grass and the lonely howl of a coyote drifting across the plains. Malachi Reed sat on the edge of his porch, his rifle leaning against the post beside him, staring out into the dark horizon. He was a man used to solitude, a man who had carved his survival into the unforgiving earth with nothing but his hands and a stubborn refusal to give in. But on that night, silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like the pause before a storm. It began with the sound of hooves, faint, uneven, a staggered rhythm that didn't belong to a horse being ridden with strength, but to one carrying a weight too heavy for its failing legs. Malachi rose, every nerve pulled taut, and moved toward the sound. His hand gripped the rifle instinctively, but when the rider finally appeared at the edge of the moonlight, Malachi's breath caught. It wasn't a rider at all, it was a child. The boy, no more than 10, slumped forward against the neck of a paint horse. His small body looked as if it had been poured into the saddle, lifeless, held upright only by sheer will or the animal beneath him. Blood glistened dark against his torn shirt, seeping from a wound in his side. Malachi hurried forward, catching the boy as he slid from the saddle. And for the first time in years, the rancher felt something deeper than caution. He felt fear. Not for himself, but for the fragile life flickering in his arms. The boy's skin was warm with fever, his breathing shallow. He was Apache, that much was plain from the long, dark hair and the woven patterns on his tattered belt. Malachi knew enough of the land and its people to understand the danger. To harbor an Apache child on a white man's homestead was to invite bloodshed. But when the boy's eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes filled with pain and trust all at once, Malachi knew there was no decision to make. He carried him inside. The cabin was modest, one room stretched around a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow bed tucked against the wall. Malachi laid the boy down gently, listening to the ragged hiss of each breath. The wound was deep, a cruel tear across his side, as if from a bullet grazing too close. Malachi's hands weren't steady as he gathered water and rags, muttering curses at himself. He was no healer, just a rancher with more scars than skills. But he cleaned the wound, pressing cloth against it until his own arms shook with the effort. The boy winced but made no sound. His small hand gripped Malachi's wrist, not in fear, but in something that felt like defiance, as though he'd endured worse and would endure this too. Malachi looked into those young eyes and felt an ache deep in his chest. He thought of his own little brother, gone these many years, buried under prairie grass after a winter fever. That same helplessness came back to him now, bitter and sharp. He whispered through clenched teeth, "Stay with me, boy. Don't you quit now." Hours passed in flickering firelight. Malachi boiled herbs his mother once used for fever, coaxed a few drops past the boy's lips, and prayed silently to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering words in his tongue that Malachi couldn't understand. But one name repeated often, fragile on his cracked lips: Chenoa. Whoever she was, Malachi suspected she was the reason he clung to life. By the time the gray edge of dawn touched the horizon, the child's breathing had steadied, though his face was pale and damp with sweat. Malachi sat slumped beside the bed, exhaustion pressing heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but his body betrayed him, dragging him into uneasy dreams filled with hoofbeats and fire. He woke to silence that was too complete, the kind of silence that pressed against the skin and set the heart hammering. Malachi rose, his joints stiff, and reached for his rifle. The boy still lay asleep, chest rising and falling faintly. But something outside had shifted. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the land, and that's when he saw them. At first, it was only one dark figure at the tree line, motionless as a shadow. Then another, and another. Within moments, the ridges and gullies surrounding his cabin were alive with movement, shapes breaking from the morning mist. Warriors. Mounted, silent, their faces painted with streaks of black and red. The rising sun caught the glint of their weapons, the restless snort of their horses. Malachi's throat went dry. 200, maybe more. The boy he had saved was Apache, and these were his people. He wasn't a fool. He knew what it meant. They would see him not as a savior, but as a thief, a trespasser holding one of their own. His cabin, his land, his very life, all of it now stood at the mercy of those riders. One warrior urged his horse forward, breaking from the ranks. He was older, his hair streaked with gray, his shoulders draped in a robe of buffalo hide. His face was stern, unreadable, but his eyes burned with a fury that needed no translation. He raised his hand, and the others fell still. Malachi stood rooted, rifle at his side but not raised. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Behind him, inside the cabin, the boy stirred and let out a faint cry. The sound carried into the morning air like a spark dropped into dry grass. Every warrior's gaze sharpened. The elder dismounted, walking forward with deliberate steps. Each one carried the weight of judgment. He stopped a few paces away, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. His voice was low, thick with accent but clear enough. "You have my son." The words struck Malachi harder than any bullet. He turned, glancing back at the fragile child asleep in his bed. The boy, the wounded stranger he had carried into his home, was no orphan. He was the blood of the man standing before him. And now, by saving him, Malachi had bound himself to a trial that would decide whether he lived or died. The elder's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on the knife. The warriors around them waited, breathless, their silence as sharp as steel. Malachi felt the truth of it sink deep. By sunrise, the land itself had turned against him. The cabin that had once been his refuge was now a cage, surrounded by 250 armed men whose wrath could set the prairie alight. And as the sun climbed higher, the question hung heavy in the air: had Malachi saved the boy's life? Or had he sealed his own death? The weight of the elder's words lingered in the morning air like a storm cloud. "You have my son." Malachi's fingers brushed the worn stock of his rifle, but he didn't lift it. To raise steel against 250 warriors was suicide. To lower his guard entirely was folly. He stood caught between two deaths, one quick, one slow, and neither promised mercy. The elder's eyes, dark and steady, never left him. Malachi saw in them not just fury but grief, a deep sorrow etched into lines carved by years of battle and loss. This was not merely a war chief demanding the return of blood. This was a father whose child had vanished into the night and returned half dead into the arms of a stranger. Malachi took a breath, slow, deliberate, and stepped aside from the doorway of his cabin. "He's alive," he said, voice gravel thick. "Barely. I gave him what aid I could." The elder's gaze flickered past him, toward the dim interior of the cabin where the boy lay. Something softened in his features, but it vanished in an instant, masked by steel again. He raised his hand, and two warriors dismounted, moving toward the door. Malachi stiffened, shifting his stance. "Careful," he warned. The rifle now balanced loosely across his arm. "He's weak. Jostle him wrong. You'll finish what the bullet started." The warriors froze at the tone in his voice, waiting for the elder's signal. The old chief raised his palm, halting them. His eyes returned to Malachi. Why? The single word cracked like a whip. Why had he touched the boy? Why had he not left him to die in the dirt? Why had he dared bring an Apache child across the threshold of a white man's home, knowing full well what it invited? Malachi didn't answer at once. He thought of his brother, fever burning him away in a winter cabin long ago. He thought of how he'd prayed for anyone to knock at that door, bringing medicine, mercy, or even hope. No one had come. His brother had died alone. Malachi had buried him with his own shaking hands. So when the Apache boy had collapsed into his arms the night before, Malachi had seen more than an enemy's child. He had seen his brother's face. "Because no boy deserves to die alone," Malachi said at last. His voice carried rough truth, no polish. "Not yours, not anyone's." The elders studied him, silent as stone. For a moment, Malachi wondered if his words had been swallowed by the wind. Then, from inside the cabin, a sound broke the stillness, the child's voice. Weak, but clear. "Father?" The warriors stirred. The elder's mask cracked. His head snapped toward the sound, and for the briefest moment, Malachi saw not the war chief, but only a man, raw and human, pulled by the voice of blood. He strode past Malachi without hesitation, pushing through the door of the cabin. The boy's eyes fluttered open as his father knelt beside him. The elder's rough hand cupped the child's face, trembling despite years of mastering violence. Words spilled from him in the Apache tongue, low and hurried, thick with emotion. The boy tried to answer, but pain cut his breath short. Malachi stood in the doorway, his rifle lowered now. The other warriors had drawn closer, crowding the porch, their painted faces unreadable. He felt their hatred pressing against him like heat from a forge. To them, he was the thief, the interloper, the pale-skinned trespasser daring to touch what was not his. It didn't matter that he had saved the boy. They had buried too many children at the hands of men who looked just like him. The elder rose at last, turning back toward Malachi. His face was lined with grief and suspicion in equal measure. You speak truth. You gave him life, but know this life is not given freely. A debt is born. Malachi tightened his jaw. He understood debts. He lived under the weight of one to the bank, one he could never hope to pay in coin. But this debt was of a different kind, blood deep, bound to honor and vengeance. What kind of debt? Malachi asked. The elder's lips pressed into a thin line. At sunrise, my people called for war. They rode to take back what was stolen. They came for vengeance. And now they find my son in the house of a white man. He stepped forward, close enough that Malachi could see the gray stubble on his chin, the battle scars crossing his neck. Tell me, is this salvation, or is it another trick? The question cut Malachi to the bone. He had no clever words, no proof to offer. He could only stand in the wreckage of fate, caught between two fires. Believe what you will, he said at last, voice low. But I gave him my roof, my hands, and the little medicine I had. If that counts for nothing, then take me now. A ripple of movement surged through the warriors, hands going to bows and rifles. But the elder lifted his hand sharply, halting them once more. His eyes locked on Malachi with a fierce, measuring fire. Then he spoke words that chilled him. Then you will stand judgment with the rising sun. The meaning was clear. Until the boy's fate was decided, until life or death claimed him, Malachi's own fate was bound to it. If the child lived, perhaps there would be mercy. If he died, the land would drink white man's blood. The elder turned back to his warriors, speaking swift and harsh in their tongue. They fanned out, surrounding the cabin fully now, horses restless and weapons kept close. A siege without walls. Malachi was trapped in his own home. Inside, the boy stirred again, whispering words between fevered breaths. Malachi moved closer, crouching by his side. Easy, boy, he murmured. You just keep breathing. That's all you need to do. The boy's hand twitched, gripping Malachi's shirt weakly. His lips parted, forming a word that wasn't Apache this time, but English. A word heavy with meaning, though faint as a dying ember. Traitor. The sound of it made Malachi's heart stutter. His eyes flicked to the elder, who stood nearby, face unreadable. But the word hadn't been for the father. It had been for Malachi. Who? Malachi asked quietly, leaning closer. Who betrayed you? The boy's eyes opened, fever bright, staring straight into Malachi's. White man, he whispered. His chest hitched, and he slipped into unconsciousness again. Malachi rose slowly, cold crawling across his skin. A white man had done this. Someone had struck down an Apache child and left him to die. And now, because Malachi had saved him, suspicion painted him with the same brush. The elder's gaze followed him, as if weighing whether to carve the truth from his chest. The warriors outside shifted restlessly, their patience as thin as smoke. Malachi understood then. The real storm wasn't the army of warriors surrounding his cabin. It was the truth buried in the boy's wound, a truth that would damn or save him depending on who spoke it first. The sun was climbing higher, burning mist off the prairie. Judgment was coming, fast and merciless. Malachi gripped his rifle tighter, the weight of it suddenly feeling like both shield and shackle. By sunrise, he would stand either as savior or as the man they would bury beneath the soil. The prairie sun rose like a blade, sharp and merciless, slicing through the mist and painting the land in blood-colored light. Malachi stood at his door, his rifle heavy in his hands, while the Apache warriors watched in silence. They ringed the cabin like wolves, 250 strong, their horses stamping, their eyes fixed on him as if he were already condemned. Inside, the boy's breathing rattled, each exhale a fight against the pull of death. Malachi knelt beside him once more, dipping a rag into the cool water and pressing it to his brow. He whispered without thinking, as though words alone could keep the boy tethered to life. "You hold on, son. You hear me? You hold on." The boy's eyes flickered open. Fever still burned in them, but there was clarity now, a fragile light breaking through the haze. His lips moved, and Malachi leaned closer. "It was not you," the boy whispered. His gaze darted to the door, where the elder waited, tall and unyielding. "Another white man. He—" A cough cut his words short, tearing through his chest. Malachi steadied him, forcing a sip of water past his lips. "Who?" Malachi pressed. "Tell me who did this." But the boy's strength faltered. His eyes slid shut, his body sagging, and for a moment, Malachi thought the life had fled him altogether. He clenched his jaw, panic pounding in his chest. Then a faint breath stirred against his wrist, shallow, but still there. The elder entered the cabin, his shadow falling long across the floorboards. He looked down at his son, then at Malachi. "He speaks of betrayal," the chief said. "But by whom? You?" "No," Malachi said firmly, rising to face him. "He spoke of another, a white man, yes, but not me. I found him broken on the plains, left to die. Whoever put that hole in his side wanted him gone before you could reach him." The elder's eyes narrowed, suspicion sharp as a knife. "Then why bring him here? Why not leave him to the earth?" Malachi met his gaze without flinching. "Because I've buried enough boys already." His voice broke despite himself. "My own brother. I couldn't save him. Fever took him in the dead of winter. I swore if I ever had the chance again, I'd fight like hell to keep another from the same fate. That's why." The cabin fell silent, save for the crackle of the dying fire. The elder studied him, his expression unreadable. Then he turned, stepping back onto the porch. His warriors shifted, restless, waiting for his word. "He lives," the elder called out. His voice carried like thunder over the prairie. "But the white man stands in judgment until the boy speaks truth." A murmur rippled through the gathered warriors. Some nodded, others scowled, but none moved against the command. Malachi felt the noose tighten all the same. He was no longer a man in his own home. He was a prisoner, bound by the fragile breath of a child he barely knew. The hours dragged like chains. Malachi tended the boy, every heartbeat a prayer that he would wake and name the one who had betrayed him. Outside, the warriors lit fires, their smoke curling skyward, a signal that could mean war or peace. Malachi couldn't tell. By midday, the boy stirred again. His eyes opened, and this time they stayed open, glassy but aware. Malachi leaned close. "Tell them," he urged softly. "Tell your father who did this." The boy's lips parted. His voice came weak, but the words were clear. "The traitor, Benson." The name struck Malachi like a hammer. Jed Benson, a drifter turned merchant who had set up a trading post just a few miles south. Malachi knew him too well. Slick smile, quick deals, always selling rifles and whiskey to whoever had coin. A man who spoke peace but thrived on chaos. The elder knelt swiftly, gripping his son's hand. He demanded words in their tongue, and the boy repeated it, "Benson." The chief's jaw tightened, rage flaring in his eyes. Around them, the warriors stirred like a wind-tossed sea, voices rising, bows snapping taut. Malachi seized the moment. "Now you see," he said, his voice cutting through the clamor. "It wasn't me. It wasn't my hand that put him in the dirt. It was Benson. And I'll wager he left that boy to die hoping you'd lay his death at my feet. He wants you and me at each other's throats. He wants war." The elder rose slowly, his face carved from stone. "Benson sells rifles," he said. "He sells lies. He feeds on blood." His voice dropped low, dangerous. "If what you say is true, then it is his fire that burns between us." "It's true," Malachi said. His voice hardened. "And I'll prove it. Take me to him. Let me face the bastard myself. If I lie, strike me down where I stand. But if I speak truth, then let it be Benson who pays, not me." The elder's gaze bore into him, searching for cracks, for deceit. Finding none, he finally nodded once. "So be it. At sundown, we ride." The tension broke like a dam. The warriors moved, preparing horses, gathering weapons. The boy lay weak but breathing, his small hand clenched in his father's. Malachi stepped onto the porch, the horizon burning with the late sun. He felt the weight of what lay ahead. To ride with the Apache meant betraying his own kind in the eyes of the town. To refuse meant certain death. Either way, the path forward was carved in blood. When sundown came, they rode. Malachi at the center, flanked by warriors whose eyes cut into him like knives. The land stretched wide, gold with dying light, until at last the trading post came into view, Benson's crooked empire of whiskey barrels and gun crates. Smoke curled from the chimney. A dog barked, and from the doorway, Jed Benson himself emerged, grin wide as ever, as though the devil had dressed in fine boots and a polished hat. His eyes swept over the riders, lingering on Malachi with mockery. "Well now," Benson drawled. "Seems the prairie's gone mad, bringing you all here together. What brings you riding with painted devils, Reed?" Malachi dismounted, his boots sinking into the dust. His voice carried flat and cold. "You know damn well, Benson. You shot that boy. Left him for dead. Thought I'd take the blame." Benson laughed, the sound brittle. "That half-breed pup? He was in the wrong place, wrong time. Ain't no crime in cleaning vermin from the land. But you, Reed? You made a mistake, keeping him alive." His hand twitched toward his revolver, but he never cleared leather. The elder's voice rang sharp in Apache, and 20 bows snapped tight. Benson froze, sweat beading at his temple. Malachi stepped forward, rage boiling hot in his chest. "You tried to start a war," Malachi spat, "but it ends tonight." What followed was chaos, gunfire cracking, horses screaming, the smell of powder thick in the air. Benson fought like a cornered rat, but he was no match for the storm he had sown. When the dust cleared, he lay in the dirt, lifeless, his smile finally gone. Silence fell. The elder stood tall, his eyes heavy with grief and grim justice. He looked at Malachi, then at his son's fragile body slumped across a warrior's arms. "The debt is paid," he said at last. "You saved my son. You faced the traitor. Between us, the blood is balanced." Malachi said nothing. His chest heaved, his hands still trembling with the echo of violence. He knew the debt was more than balanced. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. To the townsfolk, he would be a man who rode with the Apache, who turned his gun against his own. To the Apache, he would forever remain an outsider. But as the elder carried his son away into the darkening prairie, Malachi felt something shift deep within him. For the first time in years, he was not just surviving. He had chosen a side, not white or Apache, not rancher or warrior. He had chosen life, chosen mercy, chosen to stand against betrayal, even when it cost him everything. The prairie night swallowed the riders one by one, until Malachi stood alone before the smoldering ruins of Benson's lies. The stars above stretched cold and endless, witnesses to all that had been lost and gained. By sunrise, the story would spread of a cowboy who saved a wounded Apache child and faced down 250 warriors with nothing but truth and a steady hand. And the question would linger, haunting as the wind. What would you have done, standing in his place? Would you have left the boy to die, safe in your own skin, or risked everything for a life not your own? Because history is not written by the safe. It is written by those who step into fire and let it shape them. If this story gripped you, if it stirred something deep about courage, betrayal, and the cost of mercy, then don't let it end here. Share it. Keep it alive. Stories like these remind us that every choice leaves a mark on history, on others, and on ourselves. Subscribe for more forgotten tales carved in blood and dust, and never forget, the past still speaks if you're willing to listen.